Thank you all for joining us for live Q&A and office hours with Professor Desmond Patton. This session is a follow-up to Professor Patton's video lecture, Community Data Science Approaches for Gun Violence Prevention, that you've already watched. I'm proud to introduce Ezine Nwankwo, one of our SICSS-Howard Mathematica staff members this summer, who will introduce our speaker and moderate our session. Take it away, Ezine.
Thanks, Nanette. My name is Ezine, and I'm a rising third-year PhD student in computer science at UC Berkeley. I'm now a SICSS-HM staff member. Today, we're joined by Professor Desmond Patton. Once again, Professor Patton studies the impact social media has on well-being, mental health, trauma, violence, and grief for youth and adults of color. He leverages social work thinking, data science, qualitative methods, and community partnerships to develop strategies to support digital grief and trauma and reduce on and offline gun-related violence. Professor Patton is the Brian and Randi Schwartz University Professor and the 31st Penn Integrates Knowledge University Professor. He has joint appointments in the School of Social Policy and Practice and the Annenberg School for Communication, along with a secondary appointment in the Department of Psychiatry in the Perelman School of Medicine. Thanks for taking the time for joining us here today, and I'll get us started with a few questions about your lecture and your work broadly. And then I'll turn it over to participants to really ask questions. So please start thinking of your questions, start raising your hands, and join the queue as soon as you can. So I'll get us started, but thank you again for your lecture, and it was really interesting. I think for me, something that I notice about machine learning models is how heavily they rely on the data and the labels to make important decisions, right? So the output of the model is really only as good as the data that's labeled. And I wanted to ask if you could talk more about the specific label classes that you chose for the Jakira-Barnes study, just because you had like specific categories of like grief, loss, and then other that kind of encompass like many categories, right? And so, yeah, just curious how you came up with that labeling scheme and how that affected your results, if at all.
Sure. Well, first, thank you so much for having me. I am elated to be with you all this afternoon. So this question around labeling and annotation is a really good one. And interestingly enough, it really dovetailed nicely with my training and background as a qualitative researcher. However, the type of practices that I use in qualitative methods in terms of deep meaning making and interpretation of textual data were not necessarily a part of the labeling process in computer science, is what I came to find out. And so let me start from the beginning in terms of our process. I'm going to walk you through that. And so first, we started our project off with deep questions around the impact social media was having on gun violence and trying to understand to what extent does language, incendiary language on social media impact future offline violence? And can we learn about triggers, words, the relationship between words and emoji and audio and video to better understand how social media could amplify future violence? And so we started off doing qualitative studies around social media and gun violence in the city of Chicago. And what we learned from that particular set of experiences is, number one, language is extremely important, but the interpretation of language is extremely challenging. And so we needed to have a process that if we're going to be looking at social media data, that we need to look at it from a more robust process, and we needed to engage in the most rigorous processes possible. And so we would take a subsample of tweets that we collected from a young Black girl, Jakira-Barnes, who had been murdered in 2014. And so from that sample, we did a deep dive to identify the most prevalent themes, qualitative themes in those social media posts. And so the most prominent themes were that of grief and aggression. However, as you probably understand, there were a lot of different dynamics, behaviors, and engagements that we saw within Jakira's Twitter profile and within her engagement between her top communicators on Twitter. But in partnering with computer scientists, there was a clear need to engage in binary classification of these really important emotions and feelings and behaviors. And so this was one of the tensions that we felt early on in our work, because there was so much happening and we weren't able to capture it all in the same way we could capture those prevailing themes, which is really problematic for me, because in the other is where there was deep and dynamic context and nuance that would help us to flesh out the relationship between aggression and grief and all the other emotions that impact how and why people type and engage social media in the way that they do. And so that was kind of how we got to this process. It was not a process that I was extremely comfortable with, but it was, I would say what you saw was the beginning of a set of processes that would then lean on qualitative sensibilities to annotate social media data.
Okay, thank you so much for that answer. Yeah, it was really interesting to hear about your process. I think it's a huge challenge that machine learning people, social scientists, like we all kind of struggle with, like, how do we decide what labels make sense and like encompass all the things that we want them to encompass? And computer scientists, I feel like the community kind of gets trap-holed into picking these binary labels that may not get at all the nuances that sociologists like want, or social sciences like want to try to capture, because like life is messy, people are doing a lot of different things. And so I do think that's like an area of research that's super exciting and that I think we as a community should work towards. So I'll ask one more question before I go to participant questions, just because I see so many hands, so I want to make sure to get to everybody's questions. But just bouncing off of what you were just talking about, as you were working with computer scientists, I wanted to ask just generally how your experience was with like this interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, multi-expertise, because you also talked about in your different projects how you incorporated like expertise of different community members in the work, in like the labeling of the data as well. And so, yeah, just wanting to understand how you went about that process and any like tips you have for people wanting to do this type of like broad collaborative work, while and the work that it takes to do that. How was it like translating languages essentially across different communities? Because yeah, I'm super curious about that process for you.
I love this question. Yeah, it really makes me smile. I have loved partnering with computer scientists, and that might sound surprising, but I also feel like I've been very lucky. As soon as I got to Columbia, I reached out to the head of the Data Science Institute, who was Kathy McEwen at the time. And what I really appreciate about Kathy is that she responded right away, which was really appreciative. She invited me to join her natural language processing community. And we pretty quickly started to work together, because I think she is quite the senior scholar, very well known in her area of text summarization. And she was willing to support my ideas. And I think one thing that was really helpful is having an idea. I knew what I wanted to do. I knew what gaps I had, and I was able to clearly articulate how I thought data science, and in particular natural language processing, can be really helpful to the work that I'm trying to do. And what I really like about partnering with computer scientists is that you all are not afraid of a hard problem, and that you're willing to kind of tackle a problem from all different angles. And there's a lot of excitement around thinking through the most innovative approach to solving a problem. And that doesn't happen as much in my discipline. And so that has always been really exciting. I think one of the things that I learned quickly is that I have expertise too, and my expertise isn't more or less than my computer science colleagues. It is just as important. And I felt like my computer science colleagues understood that as well. We understood that I had a clear field expertise in a subject matter expertise around gun violence, around Black youth, that was important to understanding and interpreting language, context, and behavior on social media, and that my computer science colleagues had tools that could help us solve those problems. And so we never had any weird tension in that space because we understood, and my expertise and my experience was valued and valuable. And so that made all the difference. Now, this is not always the case. There have been situations where, because I am a social worker and come from a social science background, I am kind of quickly moved into the broadening participation or broadening computing space, which is fine. I like to hang out there too. But social science domain expertise is not something to be added on later. It's usually really helpful in formulating the research question and thinking about the ethical dilemmas and challenges, and also thinking about various theories that can help us understand what we're seeing as well. So I've really had, a really great experience. And to be quite honest, I'm not sure I would have got tenure or have had the career that I've been able to have had it not been for these collaborations that have been exciting. They've been challenging, but more exciting than challenging. And they have taken me places that were never a part of my plan. I did not train in this area. It was not something that I sought out to do. But I also I got a lot of support. And I think a part of that was I was able to connect with folks who already had amazing careers, and they were willing to be a guiding light in this space. And so I was able to partner with folks in natural language processing and computer vision, and other computer science spaces as well. And this was entirely new to me, but I think also my computer science colleagues were excited to have a different approach as well, to think about topics that were not contemporary in computer science spaces, like issues of gun violence and grief and loss, and now some of my new work on joy and well-being. So I think there was excitement on their end to be able to apply these tools in areas that really matter for our society.
That's awesome. That really does make me happy that you've had such a great experience working with computer scientists and want to continue that and are an advocate for that. So yeah, that's really cool. So yeah, I'll open it up to participant questions. So the first we have up is Nina.
Thank you again for being here, Professor Patton. So I have 3 questions. I can drop them in the chat if that's easier, or maybe you'll remember, I'm not sure. First, pertaining to CHASM, I was wondering if it has been applied outside of Chicago, and if you could speak to how that has been done, or if not, what considerations should be taken if we were to utilize CHASM but across borders. That's one. Secondly, how can we ensure that we uphold safety and ethics and push back against the pervasive attempts to stereotype and stigmatize and police and surveil Black communities? How can we do this work that largely takes place on social media and is very much in the public eye? How can we address this while at the same time, maneuvering that aspect there? And thirdly, could you please speak more about your work on incorporating joy on the platforms? I'm not sure if it's particularly for the youth you work with or in general, but I'm very much interested in you elaborating on just your work on joy and how that might act to combat gun violence.
Sure, thank you for your question.
More, but I'm pretending to have 3.
I will attempt to tackle those 3 questions. So the first one, I have not personally applied CHASM outside of Chicago, but it was designed to be agnostic of location, of question, of approach. The goal is to offer a process for thinking reflexively about how we use social media data for societal purposes, and to really first suggest that we're all biased and that we bring a set of biases to how we look at data, how we talk about data. One of the things that I talk about a lot is that as a Black gay man from the South, there were a number of survival things that I did that were white supremacist and toxic, that fueled how I thought about Black folks, in particular Black youth. And I didn't recognize that until I was working with Black youth, in particular young Black girls, and the kind of narratives that, you know, really weren't my own, that I had subsumed, that became my own. And then I layered on to people that I was observing on social media platforms. And so Chasm forced me to think about context in ways that I had not. And it forced me to search for context, to say to myself and to my team that we don't know what we're talking about, and we need to acknowledge that, and that acknowledgement is a part of the research process. And so my hope is that folks use Chasm for an array of data sets, for locations, for other problems and research paradigms, to see if it is advantageous in those spaces. The second question, I think I am blanking on.
I was asking about how do you combat policing, or this work even used for policing and stigmatization?
Yes. So this is such an important question, and it is the thing that has been kind of the bane of my existence in my research, and the thing that has kept me up at night the most. I have been very concerned about how the data that I've collected can be used. I've been concerned around misinterpretation, miscalculating, misunderstanding of Black and brown young people on social media. But what I've learned is a couple of things. Number one, there is something that I can do about it. I can tell better stories, and I can remove my ego and allow the stories of Black children to be centered, to be understood, to put them in the forefront, so that we're telling robust and complicated and nuanced stories. But again, going back to that original point, that really takes being comfortable with becoming a reflexive thinker, whether you're a computer scientist or a social scientist. And I began to realize that this need to kind of understand, if I'm really interested in transformational justice through social media and AI and understanding these worlds, then what do I have to do as a researcher and as a user to decolonize my thinking, to reimagine my thinking, to engage in speculative thinking, so that I'm not fixated and embedded in trauma narratives and trauma stories. And that is work, right? That's the work that we oftentimes don't talk about in DEI work. There's work that white people need to do, and there's work that people of color need to do. And my work is more advanced. I think the work that we have to do is more advanced, and it is at this DEI level of understanding culture and understanding the narratives that you've been told as a person of color, removing trauma, confronting trauma, talking about survival, talking about oppression and how that has impacted how we look at the world. And so doing that work is important in terms of how you layer that into questions and how you layer that into analyses and how you talk about implications of the work. So that is like the foundation. And then that foundation is influenced and informed by my values, right? My values suggest that I don't work with police. And so I get, as you might imagine, I get tons of emails and calls from law enforcement from various states and locations and places to offer advice around how they might use social media to surveil Black and brown communities. And I do not support that. I do not work with that. I do not engage in that space. But that wasn't where I started, because I started because I wanted to reduce and prevent gun violence. And so I thought, oh, well, if I work with the police, then that might do it. And then we have so many examples of why that would be problematic. And it took, honestly, it took me connecting and embedding myself in the scholarship of Black folks in the social technical spaces to really think about how I might do this work better and more ethically. And so these aren't things that I started off with. These are things that, you know, most importantly, I learned from Black women in this space. So it's kind of a roundabout way of saying it's really about, you know, having a foundation of justice, of reflexivity, of being willing to die to yourself and check your ego, being willing to be open to your own biases that inform the kind of decisions that you make that can be detrimental to the communities that you're trying to help and support and work with. And the third one, sorry, quickly, Joy. The Joy Project is brand new. And it birthed out of this kind of space of being in grief, because what I realized is that there's a lot of Black and brown folks who are using joy and laughter and humor and just kind of well-being as micro interventions for things that are happening in digital and physical spaces. We've seen it on Black Twitter, you're seeing it on TikTok as well, where folks are reimagining what a healthy digital life can be, and critical to that is engaging in proximal and distal experiences with joy. And I'm saying joy is kind of is not necessarily the term that we all might use. It could be something else, that's kind of a Western term, but I wanted to explore how we could help people experience and connect and define these concepts more quickly. And so I formed a youth advisory council, and we're working with youth from New York City and Philadelphia, and we are working collaboratively to think about how we might create a platform or a social media channel, or maybe an addendum to current social media platforms, where folks or youth of color can just kind of be in joyful spaces and not be locked into algorithmic systems that are pushing them into content areas that they may or may not be interested in. So how do we help people find and kind of experience more joyful experiences on social media? So we are in the brainstorming phase. We have some prototypes of platform-like experiences. And so hopefully by the end of the fall, we will have something that we will demo and get feedback on.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I'm really excited to hear about your future work on Black Joy. Like, that sounds really exciting. So yeah, thanks for sharing. Gia, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Thank you, Dr. Patton. I think your research and the papers is very important for youth, especially the young people in Black community. So my first question, I have two questions. My first question is, I was wondering, do you have any chance to share your results, the results of your research with the young Black individual you study, or their family, their parents? How did they respond, and what feedback did they provide? That's the first question. And second question is my second question is more on technical side. I noticed that in your 2019 paper, you incorporate the image of tweet into the social media analysis. Could you talk more about how you approach this image data analysis in your research?
Great questions. Yeah, for sure. So the first one is, I spent several hours with Jakira's mom. Her name is Ms. Chantel Brown. And this was really important to me because I spent years being afraid that she would hate the research and that she would find it problematic or, you know, trauma-inducing. And that was absolutely not the case. Ms. Brown wants to make a difference in the world and understood that her daughter's life, while it's hard to relive it, to be clear, that she thought that this was what she needed to do to hopefully prevent another act of violence. And so I am writing a book about Jakira. ask me about it because I need to finish it. And her mom is threaded throughout the book. And I think the most important piece around this book, around talking to Jakira's mom, is that a lot of the things that I thought I knew, I did not know. And she shared with me all the things she tried to do to keep her daughter safe. I mean, this mother, who had 3 other children, by the way, and Jakira has a twin brother, would do anything possible to keep her child safe. And you would never know that in the media. There's lots of stories about Jakira. If you Google her name, you'll see a lot of media content around her, but you will probably not hear a narrative around this Black mother's desire, her mission to do whatever she could to keep her daughter safe. And I think that these are the stories that were not being told about experiences around gun violence. And I think these stories, I think what I've learned is that by engaging in this data science and social science connected work, is that if we try, we can be better storytellers of telling complicated and culturally rich stories. And so, you know, Jakira's mom is very much centered in these algorithmic systems that we're using to find grief and loss. And I didn't realize that, but it fuels how we define labels. It fuels how we think about the implications of this work. And so that interview, those stories, that experience is critically important. The images. So the images we thought were really important because we were seeing just kind of observationally some differences in how images could conjure up meaning making around grief and aggression in different ways. And so we pulled a subsample of tweets that had an image that would accompany it, and that we had social work students who were using the same labels that we use for our textual analysis and applied it to analyzing those images. And so those students would then do bounding boxes around a set of images. And those images would be categorized as either aggression, loss, and then we added substance use because we saw a fair amount of images that related to substance use. And then in that paper, we wanted to determine, does computer vision related analyses, is it better at finding grief or aggression or substance use, or is NOP better, or is there some type of relationship in which they both work really well? And so what we found is that NOP was much better at identifying, automatically identifying expressions of grief because they're more expressive, right? And so our annotators felt more comfortable with identifying those expressions in their annotation process because there was more words to work with, versus the computer vision elements, pictures of guns, pictures or videos that seem to depict a violent moment were found more easily with computer vision tools than NOP tools. And then NOP and computer vision were both as successful with automatically finding concepts of substance use. The images that you saw, however, none of those images are from our data set. So one of our ethical principles was when we present any of our computer vision data, except for Jakira Barnes, because most of her images were already so publicly available, it just didn't make sense to try to hide them because she was a news story before we started this research. But all of those images are from a stock Google pile. So there are examples of the types of things that we found, but they're not associated with any of the participants or users from our Twitter study.
Thank you. I'm gonna have Rebecca and Jacqueline ask their question together just to save up on time. And then I have another question, and then so me and James will go together for the last set of questions. Unless anybody asks any more questions, please raise your hand. But yeah. Rebecca and Jacqueline, why don't you guys go ahead and ask your question?
Well, thank you so much. Now I want to hear about the book that you're working on and the angle that you're taking on that. But I was kind of curious about, I know that there's a lot of politics in the criminal justice space with the use of like risk assessments and how they can be used and weaponized to sort of move towards like predatory policing. And I guess so when I'm engaging with your work, I'm sort of really inspired by this possibility that we could be sort of using AI to bring in a more cultural awareness for better outcomes, right? And I guess I'm curious, like, I know that you had said in the video that you're not particularly optimistic about the use of these models to potentially like be saving lives in some of these communities per se. But there was another moment where you were talking, I think you highlighted specifically that at least in one of the algorithms, they basically identified a person who would literally like probably die in a couple of days or something. So I guess I'm just curious, like, what you see as the sort of trajectory towards the way that AI could potentially be used here. Is there something here, or should we just be throwing it out? Thank you.
Do you mind if I just respond to that question first and then go to the next one?
Totally.
So I can't hold everything in my head. Your question is so timely, and I'm actually on my 4th chapter writing about this very issue. It's complicated for me. It's complicated. I think I have been on this journey of where I was very optimistic that we could use these powerful, innovative tools to reduce violence, and we could find the bad guy, until I understood that the bad guy meant Black folk, right? And so once I understood that, my values changed, my perception changed. I am hopeful, and I know that we can ask better questions of data. And I think that's where we need to spend more time. I think we need to engage in more rigorous processes to ask better questions. And I think this is a place where ChatGPT could be helpful as a tool, so that we are thinking and considering a multiplicity of trends, of ideas that we may not have because we're not in highly interdisciplinary spaces, so that we have enough information to ask better questions of data. And I think a part of it is having your non-negotiables, right? So what are the things that you're not going to do, or what are the things that are not hopeful to do? And so I think that we can get to a space where we can use these tools to really get at root causes of problems. So one of the things that I learned is that grief is real in the Black community and not treated very well, because our understanding of grief is trained on white folk. And so we don't really get Black grief. We don't understand it, and we don't understand its role in gun violence. And I think that being able to look at social media, because social media gives you so many different aspects of a person, even if that person is personifying, falsities or aspirational selves, that is a factor of who we are, right? Lying is a part of who we are as people. Having an aspirational self or only posting your best pictures is data that is useful to help us understand human behavior. And so I think that we can do better, but I think, asking better questions and pairing that with your non-negotiables is really important. And so I'm so excited to see these new cadre of folks like you all that are going to be wrestling with data and wrestling with the implications of data in different ways. Because a part of the challenge is that, we weren't trained to do this, right? And so I got my Ph.D. at Chicago. I never had a class on ethics, never. And I was in a social work program, but never a direct class on any of the things that I'm now wrestling with as a scholar. And so I'm so thrilled that you have an opportunity to really think about this carefully.
Thanks so much for that response. That is also a question, and Rebecca for asking the question. That's definitely a question that I grapple with as well. And so I appreciate your response. And I too am hopeful for better questions that we need to be asking to help create better solutions for society's most challenging problems. So thanks. Jacqueline, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Very interesting research. I have a question about if you could find in your data some data related to intrafamiliar violence and connect to the masculinities and gender violence. If you could relate the intrafamiliar suffering of this male with the data that you are tracing.
Yeah, this is a good question, and I guess what I can share is just some stories that I've heard from more of my qualitative interviews with some folks with in Jakira's family and her life that I think really helped me to understand Jakira and kind of why she behaved and engaged Twitter the way she did. One is that her mom said over and over again that Jakira is like me, that she grew up in the same neighborhood and dealt with similar levels of violence, and that Jakira's behavior wasn't necessarily surprising to her because her mom had to engage in survival tactics and strategies. Now, she said they didn't use guns when she was growing up, they had knives, but the way in which she had to survive was apparent, and she thinks that Jakira's life is in response to that. And Jakira's twin brother also had several kind of was justice impacted as well, and her mom was constantly trying to identify resources for both Jakira and her twin brother. And so I think that the context of living in a neighborhood that has histories of trauma and violence became a cyclical thing for this particular family that was just really hard to get out. And this wasn't a mom who was sitting on her hands, though. And so I think that piece is important when we talk about intergenerational violence, is that, or experiences, is that oftentimes it feels like things are just happening over and over again and no one's doing anything, and people are just kind of constantly in cycles of trauma. And while that could be true, there's also individuals embedded in those systems, those family systems, that are trying their damnedest to get out of that. So she sent her daughter to one of the top charter high schools on the south side of Chicago. She sent her to a math and science academy with the intention of acknowledging gun violence, of acknowledging intergenerational violence to help get her daughter out. And while she was in that K-8 school, she was doing well. It was up until around 8th, moving into the high school context is where things changed. And it wasn't just Jakira, it changes for a lot of young people. That 8th to 9th grade transition is a really hard one for folks. The masculinity piece is interesting, particularly as it relates to Jakira. I think Jakira would probably identify as lesbian and would probably identify as masculine. I'm not sure if Jakira would use terms as trans, but and I use her because her mom identifies Jakira as her, so I just honor her mom in that way. But through her Twitter life, most people refer to Jakira using male terms. And I think you see a transition in images on Twitter from 8th grade, where images where one might ascribe as being more feminine in nature, and then moving into high school and seeing images of her being embedded in drill music videos where her outfits and demeanor were more masculine in nature. And I think as I look deeply into Jakira's life, a part of this ascribing connection to masculinity was about protection of her and family as well. And so I think that being able to thread those lines between intergenerational violence and trauma, and how people identify, how people ascribe labels as protection for themselves and families becomes a really important piece. I have not studied it deeply, but it's something that I'm writing about in my book, because I've struggled with how to talk about Jakira in gendered terms, because she was dead by the time I encountered her, but the ways in which she used social media and how people engaged with her left more questions than answers.
Thank you so much. James, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. Thank you so much. One of the things that really stood out to me was about your use of digital neighborhood, where someone tweeted and then within 3 hours, they were killed in that same space. I'm really curious. It's not something I had ever thought about, that we do have digital neighborhoods, but can you elaborate more on how that comes to play in your research on things like ethnography, which is another term that I had to look up when I looked at the overall layout of the transdisciplinary research you did. So I've learned a lot of new terms, but I'm very curious about how the digital neighborhood plays out in terms of like violence and how different it is from like the actual real neighborhoods that youths do find themselves at.
So thank you for that question. So digital neighborhood is a term that was developed by Robin Stevens out of the University of Southern California at the Annenberg School there. And, you know, our understanding of this term is really trying to describe a set of dynamics, behaviors, and engagement that mimic the physical world in terms of how people communicate, how they socialize, how they identify, how they relate to one another, but layering that connectivity offline within digital platforms and understanding the extent to which digital platform shapes, reconfigures those connections, right? And so what is interesting is that you see a lot of similarities in communication styles on digital platforms that you would see in the physical world, but the differences are particularly around the amplification, the location, the connectivity, and the ability to kind of move well beyond one's physical space and to interact in a global manner, which really, particularly when you're in a when you live in a neighborhood that is consumed with violence, can be amplified and shaped in really harmful ways in digital spaces. And so that's really kind of what we're trying to get at. But this really kind of came to a head for me. I was doing some interviews with young folks in Chicago, and a young man came up to me, we were talking, and he said, Facebook is life. And then when he said it to me, it resonated so much, because I think for a long time, a lot of us, a lot of scholars thought, oh, there's this physical world and this digital world. And what that meant to me is that we can no longer use those terms because they're not serving how we connect and understand young people's lives. That their worlds are so intertwined that what you do on offline resonates online and back and forth. That back and forth nature needs to be represented in how we talk about the digital world as well. It's not this virtual thing that's just happening. It is a place of life. And so that's kind of what we're getting at when we see digital neighborhood. But please check out Robin Stevens' work. She's doing dope work out of USC.
Thank you so much for that. And just piggybacking off of James's question in terms of like, and your response around these platforms like being life for a lot of youth coming up, and for a lot of a lot of people globally. Curious how you think the different platform policy changes, specifically Twitter's policy change in terms of access to its API, how that's going to affect research of this kind. And have you thought about like how other social media platforms are now like coming up, like TikTok and things like that, and how that kind of is going to affect research in this specific area?
Yeah, look, it's highly problematic. I think, so not every study coming out of Twitter was helpful or, something that we need to mimic. However, there were lots of things that came out from the use of tapping into these hoses that allowed us to understand misinformation, that allowed us to understand hate speech, that allowed us to understand COVID-19 communication. It is a valuable resource. And so I think, and I think it has led to other innovations. And so the lack of connection to that hose, I think, is not helpful. And so I think as a community, we need to devise, let me back up. We need to advocate for why having access to these types of hoses ethically is important for building our scientific evidence base for health. These are health questions. These are political questions. These are societal questions. And I think that there has been lots of research that has been really helpful for our society. And so I think I am a big fan of TikTok. And I think that these platforms really provide us with complicated understandings of the lived experience. And I think that we really need to be convening to identify the most ethical ways of tapping into these spaces. And I think a part of the problem is that it feels like a disparate effort, right? So I know some big name groups and other groups that are not super diverse that are asking for resources, that are trying to identify, but I feel like you have to be in the know. Like, it's not just a thing that is publicly available in terms of what we should do, how we should advocate, what we need. And I don't see the point in that. I think if this should be kind of a universal understanding of how we can tap into these things. But I think we don't understand them. We're not talking about them as being public health related and what these things can do for public health. And that's a part of the challenge. So I think a part of the narrative, this is why interdisciplinary collaborations are really important in this space, is that we need to get the storytelling right, so that when we're advocating for what we need, that we're not just talking out our ass or just asking for things that we need, that we're asking for things that are kind of globally helpful and globally scalable as well.
Yeah, no, exactly. I agree as well. Rashid, you have a question. Do you want to go ahead and ask? You're muted.
You got to have somebody do that at least one time in Zoom Universe first session. So pardon me if I'm exceeding the quota. So peace, thank you, Zane, and thank you, Doctor, for the presentation and the information. I think short comment before the question, I was thinking about like why Twitter opposed to some of the other platforms. So for example, you know, Instagram, like younger people I know, they're on that platform. I meet a young person, they don't even ask my number no more. They want my Instagram, right? And then I was thinking about my Google Chikira. I found these YouTube videos. And so I know YouTube is this whole genre, like I remember the documentary Hood to Hood that came out some years ago. And so there's kind of like these hood documentary. And so, you know, she pops into one of these and the neighborhood does as well. And so I was curious just why that platform for this research, and then how does the question either influence which platform you choose, or how does the platform maybe limit or encourage certain types of questions to be asked?
Yeah, that's a dope question. So Twitter, it's pretty simple. In the news article that I found Chikira's story, they listed her Twitter handle. And so it was the first place that I was able to identify as a space where Chikira was hanging out. And it was publicly available, right? And so I didn't have to follow her on Facebook or find her on Instagram and be accepted in order to see her Twitter life. And again, I started this project in 2012. And so back then, Black youth were still pretty engaged on Twitter. We know that's not the case anymore. Barely anybody is on Twitter anymore. But back then, it was still a popular place, and it was a popular place for young Chicago teens as well. So it felt like the right place to be. Now, within her Twitter profile, there would be links and mentions to some of her Facebook life. But interestingly enough, she didn't post as much on Facebook. It wasn't a place. She had more images on Facebook, but it was clear that that wasn't where she was spending her time. All of her friends were on Twitter. It clearly, 2012 to 2014, 2015 was still a high time for Black youth on Twitter. So that's the reason why I focus on Twitter. Of course, that wouldn't be the case today. And I think that's why it's extremely important. I've always kind of worked with youth as domain experts in the lab. And then part of that is to understand where people are, what new platforms are up, and how people are using those platforms so that we stay current in the work. And so, our work on Joy is not a Twitter-based experience. It's more of a TikTok-based experience. But that's how we got to Twitter.
Thank you so much for sharing, for asking questions to the participants, for answering questions, Professor Patton. We really appreciate your time. I have one more question, which is just generally, what's a question that you wish we would have asked you?
Oh, wow. Like, why do I do this work, right? I think I would love to talk a lot more about why I do this work, and I'm also happy to talk more about the book and like why the book. I'm not in a discipline where books are required, and so the book piece was really a chance to engage in broader, more holistic conversations about what I learned from this young Black girl in her death and what she taught me, and then to also be able to elaborate in more complex ways the mistakes that I've made so that other people cannot make those mistakes, or to think about how you can ask better questions and engage in really team-based science in a way that can be fruitful when thinking about this intersection of tech and society.
Awesome. Rashid, do you want to go ahead and ask another question, and then James after?
Yeah, I had a follow-up question. Thank you. So, Doctor, why do you do this work?
So this is a great question, and I am the son of a justice-impacted person. My father was in prison all of my life. He got out in 2018. And then within 6 months, he was dead. He was found under a bridge in our hometown. And my interest in gun violence, my father was gang involved. And so I've always kind of knew of, his life. And he went to prison because he shot someone. And so that is the reason why I got involved in working with young people and getting involved in the gun violence research space. Also, and I know there's a number of education folks here. What I didn't mention is that I went to my PhD program at UChicago to study urban education. So I was an education person as well. And as you probably understood, in Chicago, I was doing work at looking at the transition to high school for Black youth. And I had a group of young people that I was following from 8th to 9th grade. And my group, got smaller and smaller because a couple of things were happening. They would die, they would be shot. They would be too afraid to continue to go to high school because they had to consistently cross gang lines, or they were experiencing so much trauma. They had siblings, parents that were shot, killed, or in prison, that their life, high school felt meaningless. And then I also engaged with a same group of high achieving Black boys who had the same experiences in terms of living, in terms of lived experience, but we're maintaining 4.0 GPAs and going off to Northwestern and other schools. So I was very captivated by like, what we're told about Black kids in education, the impact of violence in that space, Twitter as a space where we can understand those experiences more, and busting up, these narratives that were shoved about the Black experience.
All right, James, you want to go ahead and give us our last question?
Sure. This is quite a short question, but I did see something related to hand gestures, and I'm interested if you've done work where you, so kind of, I've seen a lot of people do things relating to like hand gestures for disabled people or American Sign Language. And I'm curious if there's something like that for like gangs. Since you've done work related to gangs, and I did see things related to hand gestures, but I don't know if there's been such connection so far. Like
there are a number of criminologists and sociologists who have, who have created glossaries and ontologies around hand gestures and other kind of, identifiable things on people's bodies that, assign meaning. I don't think that's a good strategy or necessarily helpful. In particular, it's absent of an understanding of adolescent development and kind of the ways in which adolescents behave and connect and socialize with other adolescents. And so there's lots of behaviors that we see that really are not, they don't have the intended meaning that we assign to. Doesn't mean that it's not equally as problematic. So you can take a hand gesture, and if I throw up a sign, that I'm just throwing up a sign because I saw someone else do it, but someone who might be gang involved sees that sign and ascribes a meaning to it, it's still problematic. I can still get my ass beat. I can still get shot. That's real. But so that's one component of it that we have to wrestle with. And there is the child who is a child, who is being a child. And I think for Black people, that childhood nature, that connection, that mimicking what others around us do, you don't get to do that. And so I've been trying to advocate for this. A lot of people are like, can you tell us what emojis might lead to violence? No, I cannot. Right? That is not helpful. That is not helping. That's not going to help us prevent violence, because that's not the reason why. That's not the sole reason someone is being shot. So I'm not a fan of these types of glossaries. I think within a team, it's helpful to be able to contend with various forms of meaning. But I think the extent to which that leaves the team and becomes a part of a broader conversation is another question that I think, engaging in reflexive practices will then lead you to the answer that's best for you.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Patton. This has really been a great session, and I've thoroughly enjoyed myself. I hope you all have enjoyed yourselves. Thank you again. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you all for watching. For more information on SICSS-Howard Mathematica, visit our website, follow us on social media, and join our email list.